Hello, happy Friday. Everyone, I'm so glad we made it to Friday. My name is Julie Hirschberg. I am the owner of Reactive Physical Therapy and Wellness, and joining you again for another Friday, another Q&A session. This session was inspired by the questions that get emailed to me and our group at Reactive. So thanks so much for sending questions our way, and we'll try to get to them. So speaking of which, if you have a question, a dystonia question, or really anything neuro related, feel free to put that in the comments here, or send us a message, and we'd love to chat about it in one of our live sessions. So, as you probably know, Reactive is a neurologic physical therapy specialty practice in the LA area where we do physical therapy, occupational therapy, exercise, personal training, yoga, specific for people with neurologic disorders. And we work with a lot of rare diseases or complex cases, things that may not be well known or well understood. And one of those is dystonia. And this week, I actually got to collaborate with an awesome group of therapists and researchers from all over the country. So, big shout out to Chelsea Brown, Kat Prince, Irene Kuo, Beth Fisher is part of our group. We're putting together a presentation on dystonia for combined sections meeting for the APTA, which is all online this year in February. So you'll have to keep your eyes out for that. And I also we teach a lot at Reactive. We teach in a group of therapists who want to grow a little deeper in these diagnoses, get mentoring. And I had one of those members, this is from our Brain Bites community, submit a question about dystonia. And I said, ooh, this one deserves a whole video. So we're going to talk through this case that she submitted, and we'll talk through, where do you start with a very complex, multi-layered case like this? Because that can be so tricky. We're also going to talk how to set up for successful treatment and graded exposure from the beginning. Um, we'll talk because there's some very specific things in this case, why addressing the underlying physical limitations are so important. And then finally, how to optimize the nervous system for neuroplasticity in dystonia. What do we know in the literature? What needs to happen? So let's dive right in. So again, thank you, Emily. Thank you for sending this case. And it's interesting because I actually referred this person to Emily, because she's in Florida. So by the way, if you need a really amazing therapist, um, Emily is in Florida. I'll give you her info. So she describes this case. So first of all, this is a person who has focal task specific dystonia, meaning a dystonia that affects the person only in a task. This can be common in particular things like musicians. So this is a musician whose focal dystonia started with piano playing, and that piano is a common one. Wind instruments are common. Guitar is another common one. This started 20 years ago. So that's really important because it's a very long time. If you think of like neuroplasticity and laying down pathways, that's a really long time. This is not something that we would expect to get better in a very short time. So that's important. It's also very complex, which you'll hear. What is interesting is that it progressed, and I have seen this happen as well. Particularly in piano playing, it's very much like a keyboard, and so this focal dystonia had progressed to include computer work as well. And this can happen. It doesn't always happen, but it can happen. And one of the things, so thinking about where to start when something has progressed, is I find it very helpful to start where it has progressed to and work your way back. Um, one of the things that Emily described really nicely in the description is there's a lot of maybe compensations or changes that have occurred along the way. So pain and fatigue in the shoulders and the back and the arm, a lot of muscle tension getting everywhere. And you can imagine if you have a thing that you really love doing, like playing piano, and it has become really hard to play because you're getting muscle cramping. You can imagine the tension that builds in your body. Usually starting through the arm and shoulder into the back, the jaw, neck can be a big one. And Emily describes even to the legs, right? So that can be really common. And I really like to start distant and go close to the source. So that might mean starting at the legs or the hips, those connecting factors. Um, Another thing is the person what has been able to find a sensory trick and a couple other postures or positions where the hand is more relaxed, and that's huge. So finding positions and postures where you can start some of the movements again is really important. So that's another great place to start. So start away. So start with some of the compensations or start with positions and postures that change the sensory input to be able to unlock some of the movement. So that's kind of the where to start with this. Now, the case, as Emily describes it, gets complicated because there's other things happening, which is very common, right? Like we all get injuries or strains and sprains, and all of those things can occur just throughout our lifespan, and those can complicate the dystonia. So if there is pain, shoulder pain, TMJ issues, they're likely going to contribute or modify the dystonia in some way. And I would be really curious, Emily, and really anyone working with dystonia, what are some of the biomechanical factors contributing here? Now, this is what I think we're really good at as physical therapists is looking at biomechanical factors. Often we forget and overlook the sensory component, for example, which is huge in dystonia. But when we kind of put on our neuro brain hat, we don't want to lose the biomechanical underlying physical issues, flexibility, the joint mobility, um, and strength, right? So, looking at how those underlying physical issues might be contributing or worsening the dystonia, or even just setting somebody up to have to sit a certain way or practice a certain way because of pain. Because one of the things that we know in dystonia is that variability is a big part of the recovery. So, varying the sensory experience. And if you have to kind of sit one way or play a certain way because of pain or other length, tension, relationships, musculoskeletal wise, that can set you up for not having a lot of variability in your playing. So these are really important factors, and I find often it's important to address some of these first. So if that person does have orthopedic injuries causing nerve pain or other pain, maybe it's migraines, right? So that's another thing to address. Um, a lot of those things will also tell me like, okay, the nervous system's pretty ramped up here. Things like nerve tension, impaired neural dynamics. This might be a big part of our pie. So I had to bring out our a part of our workbook. So I've been talking about the workbooks a lot here. And this particular piece of the workbook is actually creating that pie chart with the person based on what you've seen and what they're telling you. And so in this particular case, this tissue issues seems like there are definitely contributing factors. You might need to tease it out a little bit more, which is what Emily so wisely told me that she's doing, is teasing that out. But I think there's a pretty big part of the pie that is some of those underlying tissue issues. They're not everything, right? Not everything, but an important part of it. I also thought just from what I was listening to is that nervous system regulation, which we'll talk about in a moment, and that altered sensory input are really big pieces of the pie. And, Emily noted too that things like Botox and medications have not been effective. And very much that is common in a focal task specific dystonia. Um, it also is a sign, I always recommend people have a movement disorder specialist neurologist to do a lot of this differential and trying different medications, but it sounds like it's not a dopamine responsive dystonia. And it's always important to check for that because if it's responsive to dopamine, then trying medication would be really important, right? So that is in conjunction with a movement disorder specialist for sure. Um, so some other things then when a person is sharing what's been helpful, like if stretching is helpful, great. Explore that a bunch, right? And that might be a little more of a clue too that there's some tissue issues that help. Um, and then when we start to think, so part three was really talking about the graded exposure piece. Um, Triggers are a really great place to start with. So Emily mentioned to me now it's just thinking about playing or even the act of sitting down to play might start eliciting some of the tension through the hand or through the shoulder even. And so this is a great place to start. Can you take one step back from that? And could that be, could you imagine it, but imagine it in a different position? Could you watch a video of somebody else playing? Could you watch that video while laying down and doing some really great autonomic toning breaths, like a weight on the belly? Or could you lay down and do it under a weighted blanket and watch somebody play piano without getting tension? So those would be some ideas to take a step back from where the person might be experiencing some of that tension and then start really slowly grading exposure back up to sitting, back up to imagining it, back up to approaching the instrument. Those are the kinds of things that Nancy Bill outlines in learning-based sensory motor training that was found to be very successful in people with focal hand dystonia and specifically in musicians. So I think there's a lot of great hope for recovery working through that way. So the one of the things that Emily shared with me is a real struggle to start doing some of those lifestyle habits for optimizing neuroplasticity. And I agree with you. And I think right now during a pandemic, these are especially hard and they can be really challenging when there is a lot of pain too. So, Emily, I think this is where your expertise as an amazing physical therapist is going to come into play and really looking at how you can help a person set up a routine, like an exercise routine, where they're not in pain. A lot of modifications, a lot of trying of different types of exercise are really helpful. But what I was going to share with this when we think about optimizing neuroplasticity and we look at the literature in dystonia, and again, thank you to Nancy Beal for all this great work. The programs that she has done have been very holistic and have a huge portion of time to optimizing neuroplasticity. So, including exercise, diet, sleep, brain healthy activities. And so, if I was going to give advice to anyone, a person with dystonia or a therapist working with somebody with dystonia, it would be, start working towards these neuroplasticity behaviors. Get your brain optimized for neuroplasticity so you can make the most out of your therapy journal. So, what does that mean? That means getting really great sleep, right? So that's going to be specific to each person. It's going to mean having, and I think if I remember off the top of my head in Nancy Bill's study, it was indeed that 7 to 8 hours of sleep. There was a real commitment on the research participants' part to that. The second is a fitness routine. And Emily, this is where, maybe exploring some joyful, maybe unusual exercises that don't trigger pain or the symptoms, right? So it might be dancing, it might be doing something to music, it might be in the water. So having a fitness routine 5 days a week, 45 minutes. Maintaining healthy hydration and a brain healthy diet. So we got three things here: sleep, fitness routine, diet, and hydration. Attending to your emotional health. This one's so important right now in a pandemic where we're all feeling a little frazzled and anxious. So, attending to your emotional health is a big part of toning the autonomic nervous system. And then finally, investigating and trialing a grounding practice. So, what do I mean by that? What I mean is a way to lower the excitation in your nervous system, specifically your autonomic nervous system. So, that might be a sitting, attention to your support surface grounding practice. So, we use a practice a lot from the mindfulness based fitness training, and it's a sitting grounding practice. And I actually wrote it out to follow myself and to give to people to practice. So, I'll pop a link in here where you can download the sitting grounding practice. Um, it can be through a mindfulness based practice. It could be a mindful walking practice. It could just be getting outside, getting barefoot in the grass, getting out in nature. It can be very grounding for people. It's a lot of exploration. It's not just one thing, it's not just listening to a meditation. That doesn't work for all people, right? So exploring those grounding practices for your autonomic system, and I would say, like, those 5 things are key. And I know that Emily's already exploring these with her patient. And these are going to be so important to that process of neuroplasticity and recovery. Emily, I'm really excited to hear from you. I know because you're in our community that we'll be able to hear how that's going. You can present this case, you can share it with us, and we can all learn along with you in our Brain Bites community. But also, if you're not in our community, you can learn through our learning and experience, because I'm going to be here every Friday to share this with you. So again, if you have questions, drop those in the comments, send us a message. Also, if you want to hear from us, I'll drop a link. We are planning a bunch of webinars coming up. We have a lot of our downloads free. Pretty much every time we're learning something, we're trying to share it with you all. So I'll put a link in there where you can grab any of those so that they're helpful for you. Next week is Thanksgiving, and I will not be here on Friday. I will be spending time with my family in our house. We're not going anywhere because of this crazy pandemic, but I won't be here live next Friday. But if you are interested in a lot of the things that we do through our education, I'll give you a little sneak peek that we are holding a gratitude sale, a thank you to you sale, and it's going to be Monday through Wednesday next week, so just before Thanksgiving. If you're not on our email list, join our email list so you get that code right to you. But you can purchase any of our recorded courses, so including all of our courses on dystonia, functional disorders, ataxia, Parkinson's disease, all of those courses, you can get those for 20% off. We only do it once a year, and that is next week. So that is coming up. Thank you again for joining me today, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.